Today we are joined by Brendan Boyd, the Ontario Forest Birds Program Coordinator with Birds Canada. As a PhD student at York University, Brendan studied the long-term effects of nesting in different-sized forest fragments of wood thrush, a species at risk in Canada. He used long-life radio tags and Modus wildlife tracking systems to monitor migration timing and annual survival. In this webinar, Brendan will discuss how climate change is affecting birds, highlighting several ongoing monitoring population programs for birds, including the Breeding Bird Survey, the Breeding Bird Atlas, and the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. Additionally, he will provide tips for bird identification and opportunities for community scientists to contribute to important data collection. Brendan, as we tested before, you should be able to share your screen now if you wanted to pop your camera on and get going.
All right. Thanks so much, Allison, and thanks to Forests Ontario for having me. And thank you to whoever has showed up to watch my webinar. I always love an opportunity to talk about birds, and I will be doing that today. All right, you should be able to see my screen and should be able to hear me right now. If everything has.
See your screen, Brendan. You might want to turn it into a slideshow though, because we can see the slides that you haven't got to yet on the left-hand side.
Yeah, that's part of the plan. You beat me to it.
Okay.
All right, as Allison mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about monitoring birds in a changing climate. So before I get started on today's subject, I wanted to explain why I might be qualified to talk about birds. I'm currently working as the Ontario Forest Bird Program Coordinator with Birds Canada. And what this program does is it monitors 5 very rare forest species that occur in Ontario. And these are, this is maybe getting a little too specific, cerulean warbler, Acadian flycatcher, prothonotary warbler, Louisiana water thrush, and red-headed woodpecker. And they're all species that have declined a ton and have very low populations in Ontario. So we go out every year and we conduct surveys where they traditionally have been, and we try to keep accurate counts on their basically population numbers and areas where they occur for their occupancy. I did a PhD studying birds at York University, and for part of that down here, I had to find nests of wood thrushes and just kind of ran a few different research projects together. But for my project, once we found a nest, we'd put up a net that we use for catching birds. We catch the birds, I take a small blood sample, and then we put a radio tag on them. And it's a very, very small radio tag. And we have a series of towers, the Modus wildlife tracking system that Allison has mentioned, basically across southwestern Ontario and the eastern US. And whenever one of these birds with a tag on it flies within about 10 kilometers of one of these towers, the tower will detect it, record that information, and then we can download it at a later time and see exactly when our birds went by. So in using these tags, we were able to see exactly when they migrated, the time of day, the exact date. And in many cases, we were even able to see how long it took them to fly across a lake as they were heading south. Another important aspect of that is that these tags last a long time. So they were about 400 days. And that allowed us to see when the birds arrived the following year. So they would carry this tag all the way down to Central America, in Nicaragua. It's one of the areas where they wintered. And then they'd have it with them all winter and then come back up and get detected as they return to the area in the spring. And more often than not, I was able to find them again on the ground, recapture them, and remove that tag again. It was a really interesting project, and it took me like 4 years of working with birds daily, hands-on. So beyond that, my kind of professional side of birds, I've also had a lifelong interest in birds and the natural world in general. I actually grew up in the GTA, and it's actually amazing how much wildlife you can find down there if you're out looking. Some of the spots that are really kind of well known for birding, in the West End, you've got Colonel Sam Smith Park, which is an excellent spot to see migrants during the spring and fall. And then in the East End, you've got Tommy Thompson Park, which is the same thing. When birds encounter some sort of an obstacle on migration, it often slows them down a little bit. So when they're heading north, they might cross that lake and then want to stop and have a rest. So they're looking for a green space that's accessible on the North Shore. And conversely, when they're heading south in the fall, they might reach the lake and then hold up for a little bit before they've got suitable amount of energy to fly across and continue their trip. So these spots, excellent during the migration period. I actually volunteered. I'm going to be talking about some of the monitoring programs later. But there are migration monitoring programs where you actually catch birds as part of the monitoring. And there used to be one that ran on the Toronto Islands that I was able to volunteer at when I was a kid. I think I started there when I was about 12. You're never really too young to get going with birds. This is now doing some raptor banding. Red-tailed hawk is a saw-whet owl. What owls pass through, they migrate in huge numbers in the fall, and some stations are dedicated to catching them. I did a brief stint as a zookeeper. Some people would say that birds are basically just specialized reptiles, and in fact, they do share a common ancestor with crocodilians, so it's not totally out of skew. And here's me with my study species of wildfire. So today, the focus of the webinar is to talk about Ontario's birds in a changing climate, and we're going to talk about a couple of the main ways that climate change is affecting birds. And there are a host of different things, but we're going to focus on two of the big ones. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how we monitor bird populations here in Canada and specifically Ontario. And the most important part of monitoring is being able to identify the species that you're looking at. So I'm going to go through a few steps that you can use to try to narrow down what bird species you're looking at. This graph is from the government, and it shows the increasing temperature in Canada. And as we all know, especially this year, the temperatures are going up. I realize this year was a bit of an outlier, but it's pretty hard to miss. This is by far the warmest winter that I can remember. So the first issue with climate change in birds is something that we call a phenological mismatch. It's also referred to as a timing mismatch. And when you think of all the birds that we have here in the spring and summer, a lot of people have kind of a misconception that they're our birds, and then come fall time, it's getting cold, so they head down to the tropics to live down there where it's nice and warm, and then they come back as soon as the spring's warm enough. And while this is correct, the mechanism behind it is actually kind of backwards. So the birds that we have here breeding in the summer, they're actually residents of the tropics. The tropics really are their home, and they're only coming up here to breed. And the reason they're doing this is because the tropics, tons of competition. Areas like where we live in Canada, where you've got this long wintering period, at the end of a period of dormancy, especially for insects, come springtime, you get this huge flush because they can't remain active during the winter. So as soon as spring comes around, you get this huge level of activity where tons of eggs hatch, insects come out of periods of dormancy, and they're just everywhere. I'm sure anybody who's been out in a woodland in late May or earlier June has taken note of the mosquitoes that'll chase you down every trail. And this is what the birds are relying on. And this big issue with climate change is that as these springs are getting warmer, these insects that are already here are starting to wake up and come out earlier and earlier. So this big peak in insect biomass is getting earlier and earlier in the season. And this affects different bird demographics in different ways. For instance, if you're here already and you live here year round, and we do have a few species that stick around for the winter, you can kind of monitor these spring temperatures and you can time your nesting accordingly. Where it gets more difficult is when you've got these longer distance migrants that are all the way down in Central America or South America, and they have no idea what the spring is doing here. So what happens if they get back too late and they miss this peak because they don't know whether it's been a really early spring like this one apparently is going to be. This is really important for these birds that breed up here because when they hatch out of their eggs, and you can see down here, this is a picture of baby wood thrushes from one of the nests that I found. The young are very, very hungry, constantly begging, looking for food. And this is because they go from this little pink, almost jelly bean looking thing that comes out of an egg, and it's referred to as an altricial young. So it has no feathers when it hatches. And this is compared to something that is precocial, like a chicken or a duck that comes out fully feathered and is immediately running around. But unlike those birds, these songbirds, they're completely helpless, and the parents need to stuff food in them, because going from this little jelly bean to a nearly fully formed bird that can sort of fly and leave the nest only takes about 12 days. So that takes a ton of energy, and it can cause big problems if the parents can't find food. So they need this high abundance. This picture here is if you set up a light that's designed to attract moths, you can attract a ton. This picture was taken in, it was late May or early June, and this is not the tropics or anything. This is actually here in Ontario. We get a huge flush of these moths at this time. There's also tends to be a ton of caterpillars coming out in late spring when these birds are looking for food. This is kind of an extreme example of the Cecropia moth caterpillars, which is the largest moth that we have here in Ontario. So they're not all going to be this size, but gives you the right idea. They're polyphemus moths. Again, just an example of a moth. These guys, again, are big. They get up to about 7 inches across, and they're actually really interesting to raise. If you have any interest in that, that's kind of a whole other thing, though. So first, I'm going to go over some of the ways that residents and short-distance migrants are dealing with this potential for timing mismatch between their breeding and their peak in their food supply. And a lot of these studies have taken place in Europe, because there's long-term data available, and Europe tends to be fairly accessible, especially Western Europe, where you don't have like a large expanse of inaccessible boreal forest like we do in Canada. So the species we're going to talk about for this example is called a great tit. And tit is just basically a European name for a chickadee. So the birds here that we call chickadees, they would call tits in Europe. So the great tit is a nest box living bird. So it's pretty easy to study. If you put up a whole bunch of nest boxes where they live, they'll occupy those nest boxes, and then you can keep track of their nesting history really easily. And what's found in these studies is that these birds are actually laying their eggs about 2 weeks earlier now than they did back in the 60s when they started monitoring it. And then when they compare this, and you don't need to worry about this warmth sun metric. It's just a way of measuring the spring temperatures, and higher the number is, higher the temperatures were in this spring. But you can see that spring temperatures are increasing, and this matches very well. It's inversely correlated with laying dates. As the springs get warmer, they're able to lay their eggs earlier. And this is interesting because they're kind of able to cope with these warming temperatures and still kind of match this food supply. The main food they rely on is a species of caterpillar from a moth. This flush in caterpillars, this peak in the amount of caterpillar food available, has also peaked about 2 weeks earlier in this time. The spring temperatures are getting warmer, nesting's 2 weeks earlier, and it's matching nicely this 2 week earlier caterpillar abundance. And what they found when they looked at the laying date, they compare it to the peak in caterpillars, that's very nicely positively correlated. So it matches up very, very well. And these birds are able to do a great job of keeping track. Again, it's really beneficial that they are residents, so they're there year round. They experience these spring temperatures and they can match it. In addition to being able to match it, there's actually kind of different abilities among females in how well they can match it. So what this graph shows is that looking at warmth sun, and again, this is just a metric for how warm it is in the spring. The positives, you've got a very warm spring, and the negatives, you have a very cool spring. And then this is looking at the difference in laying dates within females. So between years, the females, 1 year, they might lay eggs 2 weeks earlier than the following year. And different females have different abilities to adjust how different these time periods are they lay eggs. So if one bird, you get a really cold spring, bird lays its eggs late, and then the following spring is really warm, and the bird has to lay its eggs early, one bird might be able to lay a full 2 weeks early and really match up, but another female might only be able to go a week earlier and not quite match up as well. And because there is variation in this population with their ability to do this, and because this variation is heritable, so it's passed down through genetics, this is showing that natural selection could be taking place. These birds could be evolving in response to this climate change. And then when we look a little bit more, and again, this population is living in nest boxes and been monitored for a long time, so they have really good ideas of fitness, so how many young the birds are able to produce each year. And they found when the spring temperatures were relatively constant in the 70s and 80s, it didn't matter how flexible you were with your timing of laying your eggs. So you could be highly flexible, not so flexible, not match it perfectly. You'd still have about the same number of young. And what they found in the later years of the study is that as the spring started getting warmer, it began to really matter. If you didn't have a lot of flexibility, you're going to have much fewer young than a bird that's got high flexibility and is able to match these spring temperatures better and really take advantage of that food peak. And this tells us that these birds are, in fact, evolving in response to climate change. So the hope is that if it's happening here, other short distance migrants and residents, these are residents, short distance migrants would be something like a robin, where they go varying distances south. Some robins will even stay around. A lot of people think a robin is first sign of spring. But if you're out in the winter for any length of time, you can generally see them huddled up in grapevines and eating buckthorn berries, and things like that to get them through. We always have a few robins around. But these birds are close enough that they're able to monitor these conditions. So it's really positive that these birds are able to evolve quite quickly in response to climate change. Where there could be an issue, though, is when we talk about long distance migrants. So these are birds that are wintering, in the case of Europe, they're wintering in Africa and then heading up to Europe to breed. For us, it's Central America, South America, and then coming up to the boreal forest in southern Canada in the eastern US to breed. This is the pied flycatcher, and it's another species that they've had really good long-term data on, and for a long-distance migrant. So you might think, oh, well, you just come back early and hedge your bets. You can wait and lay your eggs. But the problem with them is they're heavily reliant on these insects to feed themselves as well. So they need at least some food when they get back. And if you come back really early, the chances of increasing like a winter storm, and I know we get a winter storm in April every couple of years, but the chances of encountering this winter storm that could very well kill you are fairly high. And that's a high cost of taking this chance. If you come back too late, you may not be able to get a territory. You're going to miss this peak in insects. You may not be able to find a mate. And then you've wasted this whole migration for nothing. And migration is about the most dangerous time of year for birds. You really want to make it worthwhile. You got to time it well. So it's a problem for them. And what they found looking at these this long-term data, because migration timing is kind of determined by genetics and day length, there is variation in it. So with time, natural selection could take place and cause these birds to arrive earlier. But as of now, they haven't found a significant difference in arrival dates. So from in the 20-year period, they monitored them, they're arriving at about the same time. Now, what they did find is that even though they're arriving at the same time, they've started nesting and laying eggs earlier with each passing year. So this means normally when they would get back and have a bit of time to recover from this long migration, and they've just flown thousands of kilometers, they're going to eat, they're going to have time to find a mate, set up a territory, build a nest. But now that they're laying their eggs earlier and earlier, they're having less and less time to do this. And you figure that's got to not be so good for you. It's got to be real stressful to get back and have to get to work immediately after this long trip. And the big issue is that the spring is continuing to advance. And there's going to be a point here where, they're arriving back. They start nest building immediately, but it's not early enough, even though they're saving as much time as they can. So at that point, it's going to come down to natural selection, but it's going to be can they evolve fast enough to match this changing climate? A bit of further research that took place on these pied flycatchers also. They have a survey method in Europe, and we have a similar one here that I'm going to talk about in a bit, where they go around and they count these birds year after year in different regions in Europe. And they found in the regions where the spring is earliest, the population is declining the greatest. Where the spring's about the same as it always was, the population's remaining stable. And they figure this must be due to this food mismatch. This brings up the question is, if we know it's affecting these pied flycatchers in Europe, what do we think is happening with all of these birds that rely on the boreal forests for food here in Canada? Because you've got long distance migrants, some coming from all the way down in southern South America. And we know they're declining, and we don't know all the reasons behind it, but there's a good chance that this timing mismatch is occurring for a lot of these species as well. Because in the wintering grounds, they just don't know what's happening up here. Another main way that climate change is affecting birds is it's changing the breeding and wintering ranges. And this is an example of a bird called a northern mockingbird that when a large survey took place, we'll talk about later, in 1981, they were barely found in the Niagara region and kind of scattered a few places in southern Ontario. By 2001, when the survey was completed again, they had spread greatly, and all these dots, these light-colored dots within the red squares, indicate a square where this bird was not previously, and then was found. There's currently a survey going on, so it's going to be really interesting to see what the 2021 equivalent looks like. And this is because these temperature dictates a lot of bird range because it dictates the habitat that they occupy. So a lot of habitats are shifting north, some other habitats are shrinking, and some areas are opening up where birds obviously weren't able to exist before. I'm going to go over some of the ways that we monitor bird populations in Ontario. And there are these three really big long-term monitoring studies called the Breeding Bird Survey, the Breeding Bird Atlas, and the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. And they're all very important, and they all kind of cover slightly different things. Another thing that's becoming bigger and bigger in recent years is eBird. And if you like doing bird stuff in your spare time, you might have already heard of it. A little bit more about that later. And then we also have some specialized programs that are designed to keep track of bird species that are not covered so well by these other three main monitoring sources. So the Breeding Bird Survey is one of the main ones that we use for estimating population trends, and it's great for knowing if a species is declining or perhaps increasing in numbers. And this is a systematic scientific continental survey of bird species abundance that was started in the 1960s. And it is standardized everywhere they do it, and we've got a huge number of routes. So there's about 3,000 routes that are surveyed every year across North America. So it has really good geographic coverage. And what these surveys are is there is a road route that's about 25 miles long, and this was created in the United States, so we're using miles. Here, a volunteer, and programs are pretty much all run by volunteers. There might be somebody who actually works to manage it, but the actual legwork is done by what we call citizen scientists, which are hugely important to basically all levels of bird research. And there are opportunities in the GTA if you're interested in working with birds. We'll go over that a little bit later. So you take 25-mile routes, and every half mile, you're doing a 3-minute stop where you get out of your car, you start a stopwatch, and then you write down every bird that you can see or hear. And again, this is a very rough count. So one of the limitations of it is that you only have 150 minutes of survey time per route per year. So it's just this snapshot. And we try to make sure that the conditions are good. It's not raining. It's not really windy. So it's somewhat standardized, but there are going to be differences. Where the strength is that it's such a long-term data set and it's such wide coverage that you can have a little bit of error in there and you still get great information from it. Another limitation is that because it relies on roads, anywhere there's not roads, you can't have breeding bird surveys. So for instance, the boreal forest takes up most of northern Ontario. Breeding bird survey can't really get in there. So what does it look like? This is an example of two graphs that were created using breeding bird survey data. And this data is publicly available. So if you go to the government website, search Breeding Bird Survey Canada, you can pull all this in specific regions. Kind of fun to play with, at least for me. And this is looking at a blackbird called the bobolink and grassland species. And you can see what it shows is that originally, when the survey started around 1960, you'd get about 12 or 13 on every survey. And now getting close to 2020, we're down to about 4 on the average survey. They've dropped an average of 0.3% per year in their population. Not good. Wood thrush is another one. This is my study species, considered kind of the poster child of declining species. And they started around 7 per survey, and now they've ended around 3. They've been declining at a rate of about minus 1.8% per year. And this is great information, really helps us target species for conservation, and it also helps us decide what should be considered a species at risk and what shouldn't. The second main bird monitoring program that we have is called the Breeding Bird Atlas, and this is very different from the Breeding Bird Survey. For the Breeding Bird Atlas, the entire province is broken down into 10 by 10 kilometer squares. And then each of these 10 by 10 squares is surveyed relatively intensely over a 5-year period. Again, this is by volunteers. I have a couple squares that I'm working on right now because we do have a Breeding Bird Atlas going on from 2021 until 2025. And this is great for detecting species that are rare. Might not be as in your face as the birds that are detected for the Breeding Bird Survey. And this also encompasses Northern Ontario. So there's tons of trips that are running throughout this 5-year period where there's a lot of volunteers, but there are some paid staff that work for the Atlas as well, going into these remote areas and searching out as many birds and trying to find as much breeding evidence as they can find. And this survey is excellent for detecting range expansion and contractions, like northern mockingbird, for instance. And it can also show population declines. So if you have a bird that's found across the province and then 20 years later, it's only in half those spots, that might be a reason to start getting alarmed. And this newest Breeding Bird Atlas, we're also doing a whole bunch of point counts, and point counts are very similar to what the Breeding Bird Survey does. So we are actually going to have some population abundance data as well, semantics, what you call occupancy, where the birds are found. I really like volunteering for the Atlas because it gets me into places that I would probably otherwise never go. And I'm having to use a GPS to find these point count locations that were created now 40 years ago. So it's really interesting to see what they've turned into. And I've ended up like way in the backcountry and in the Kawartha Lakes and in Peterborough counties. In Parry Sound for that matter. This is an example of some data between the first 2 breeding bird atlases that ran in Ontario. And the first is a species called a purple martin, and they're easily detectable. They live in these colonies. If you're ever down in southwestern Ontario these days, you may have been lucky enough to see them, though they are becoming increasingly rare. In the first atlas, you can see all these red blocks represent breeding confirmed. Orange is if they're probably breeding, and yellow is if they were seen in an area where they could be breeding, but we don't really have any evidence beyond that. And then when you look 20 years later, every square that now has a black dot is a square where this bird was previously detected, where it has not been detected in this atlas. And unfortunately, I suspect that this current atlas we're working on is going to show that their numbers are even further reduced. This is a bird that I used to be able to see around Peterborough with some regularity, and now it's very, very hard to find. They're an aerial insectivore. They catch birds on the wing, and a lot of aerial insectivores are declining pretty severely these days. Certainly problems with insects, with pesticides, and other things. So the last kind of broad scale migration monitoring The last broad scale population trend monitoring system that we have is migration monitoring. And this is where you actually go out and you catch the birds and sample them. So looking at this picture here, this is a Wilson's warbler that has stumbled into what we call a mist net. And so you can visualize it. A mist net looks a lot like a volleyball net, but it's made of a much finer mesh. That's very hard to see. They tend to catch people as well as they catch birds, just because you don't really see them easily as you're walking through the woods. And we've got stations that are found across Canada that will set up a series of these nets every year. And generally it's like 12 or 14 at a lot of the stations that I've been to. And they open them on the same dates and close them on the same dates every year. And then they open them every day for the same time period, starting a half hour before sunrise and then running them 6 hours. And because it's standardized, they can compare what they catch year after year after year. And if they're catching fewer of a bird year after year after year, you could estimate that that bird, probably the populations are declining. And what's really good about migration monitoring is that because we do it during migration, it's catching all these birds that are normally inaccessible. Up in the boreal forest, they all have to kind of pass through on their way down. So we're basically sampling everything. And it's a really good way to look at, create trend lines, population trends for many species that are hard to with the other survey types. One of the limitations of it is that it is very expensive and labor intensive. Again, this is run by volunteers. I've volunteered at numerous stations. Tommy Thompson Park has a station right in the GTA, and anybody who's really interested in birds, sometimes they let visitors come out and watch them catching and banding birds during the migration periods. So totally look into their website and see if you can contact them if it's something that you might be interested in. But yeah, tons of volunteers, the nets, everything else is fairly expensive. There's lots of fundraising involved with migration monitoring. This is an example of warblers that are caught at Long Point, and you can see that they are declining according to the migration monitoring trends. And this is a bird that's detected pretty well by the breeding bird survey. And you can see that the trend estimates match up quite well. So migration monitoring is a good way to compare these two. Some of the more specialized programs, we have Project Feeder Watch, which is just as simple, and some of these are really easy to participate in. If it's something you're interested in, check out the Birds Canada website, and you can find information on all these programs. Project Feeder Watch is as simple as just looking out your window and recording the birds that come to your bird feeder. And the Great Backyard Bird Count is a targeted event that basically does the same thing, where they try to get as many people to get this snapshot of what's going on during the same time period. You have the marsh monitoring program, because marsh birds are often hard to detect using some of the other survey methods. So we go out and try to find them. Loons are another one where we're specifically paying attention to loons, and cottagers often contribute to this data. The Christmas bird count is actually the longest running bird count we have in North America. It's been going for more than 100 years. And this is where a group goes out one day a year or close to Christmas and counts all the birds across the county. Usually form into teams and split up and cover as much area as you can. Canadian Night Survey, these are birds that are active at night, so they'd be hard to detect during the daytime. So they'll go out and look for these. And then of course the Nocturnal Owl Survey. Owls start breeding earlier in the season than most birds, so now would actually be the perfect time to go out and listen for owls. So the Nocturnal Owl Survey is a dedicated survey where you go out at night during this breeding season and you listen for owls. Bird is kind of the last one here. Anybody has any interest in birds, highly recommend getting an eBird account, completely free, and you can keep track of every bird that you see. And more this is being used for science. So if you're going out and doing a simple checklist, even if you're seeing pigeons, house sparrows, starlings, and crows, that data could contribute to important science one day. So it's a great way to get involved with almost zero commitment. All right. In order to do accurate surveys, we need to know what birds we're looking at. Super important. And we can break it down into a series of different levels, and they'll each provide you different information. And sometimes level one, I'll tell you exactly what your bird is. Sometimes you kind of got to go through everything. Found that once somebody knows all their birds and really recognizes them, it's not so much a matter of this. There's actually somebody at the University of Toronto that's studying this, and they found that people recognize birds the same way they recognize the faces on other people, where you don't notice like, hey, you know, my friend, they got a big nose, their eyes are kind of wide apart. When you look at birds, if you know them all, you don't really look at the individual features, you just kind of see it and you recognize it as something that you know. But for the beginner, these steps are very helpful. When we're talking about size and shape, it's pretty variable in birds. You could have things that are very large, and you could have other species that are very small and compact. Sometimes you can also have birds that are large, maybe not that tall. Something like a penguin is pretty large, but not very tall. And then you can have birds that are small, but a little bit more lanky. It can get tricky where birds can have multiple shapes. And this is an example of a green heron. They can stretch out quite long, and then they can also go down quite small. And then you have other birds that you could describe as round. Always when you see a bird, though, and you're trying to figure out what it is, try to get an idea of its relative size and shape. Size can be hard to judge if you don't have anything to compare it to, but even a broad estimate is very helpful. The next thing you want to look at is your context. So you're going to look at behavior and habitat. So each main type of habitat, chosen 4 here, a forest, grassland, aquatic, wetland, they're each going to have their own group of species that might occur there. And by knowing what habitat you're in, you can immediately narrow down the types of birds that you're going to see. So what do I mean by behavior? Well, you might have birds at different heights in a forest. So if you have a bird walking on the forest floor, you could have birds clinging to the side of a tree trunk. You could have birds feeding in the canopy. And the same goes for grassland. You might have them hovering overhead, sitting in the top of a tall tree, walking around in the grass. Always good to note the habitat and what the bird is doing when you see it. For some examples, if you're in the open country and you see birds all on power lines, there's a good chance they're swallows, especially if they're smallish and kind of cigar-shaped. If you're in the forest and you see a bird facing downwards on a tree, woodpeckers tend to go upwards. If you see a bird going downwards, it's likely a nuthatch. Open country, you see a very large bird sitting on a deadhead. This is probably going to be some species of hawk because they like to sit up high and look for prey items that they can surprise down below. If you're on the beach and you see birds kind of running in and out with waves, again, this is going to be an aquatic habitat, and it's going to be, you know, foraging on the beach, on the ground. That'll narrow it down to shorebirds. The warblers are a little bit tricky, but they tend to be in forest tops around the same size. And if you see a bird overhead that's huge and holds its wings kind of in a V, then feeders as it flies, very likely going to be a turkey vulture, and they're found kind of everywhere. If none of that narrows it down, we can get into more specific characteristics. This is color and pattern. Looking at some of these warblers, and these pictures are all taken at a migration monitoring station that I volunteered at. All these warblers look very similar in shape. You can see there's these 2 up here and this one over here, and this one up here. But when we look at the patterns on them, they're very, very different. So you can start looking at more specific details. And when you're describing details, you got to kind of know what the names of the bird parts are. And while this is technically correct, it can get a little bit more specific than that. And you don't have to memorize lists or anything like that. But this is available, and you can find this in a lot of field guides, and it really helps for describing different things that you're seeing when you're out looking at birds. This is a good example of birds that are going to be in similar habitats and are about the same size and shape and are going to have similar behavior. You might want to get into this color and pattern to try to break down exactly what species you're looking at. It's a helpful feature of a lot of field guides that they'll actually point at some of the areas that you should pay special attention to that can help separate them from other species. In the orchard oriole, we can see that it's the only one here that's brick red. And that's a pretty good feature to tell it apart from these other ones that are largely orange and black. The female, you can see it's pointing at this area, and we look over here. This is called the breast of a bird. It's down in the front. And again, while the breast of the orchard oriole male is brick red, the female is going to be kind of a greeny yellow. And we look at the other ones, and they're more orangey. We get into Baltimore oriole, usually black and orange. You can see these arrows here. This arrow is pointing to, it looks like the cheek. The cheek bird, fine way to describe it. It's also known as an auricular, but you can see it's black. And we look at the other black and orange orioles on this page, they both have an orange cheek. So we could just look at one simple thing, you know, immediately we're looking at a Baltimore oriole. It's helpful in the GTA too that these two species don't really occur there. So you can pretty much rule them out all the time. So there is a very lost Bullock's oriole in Hyde Park right now, of all places. Bullock's oriole, you look at the facial pattern and you can see it's got this orange eyebrow and this black line through the eye. And this combination of features, again, sets it apart from the other species on this page. These are good examples of how you can look at specific details if your other steps are not going to work. Some of the common Toronto species that you might run into, and curious how to tell them apart because they look superficially similar. Common grackle, European starling, they both are largely black, but there are a few main differences you can look at. The bill color on a grackle is going to be black and a starling is yellow. A grackle has a light eye, a starling has a dark eye, and then a grackle has this huge tail that's really obvious, especially when they fly, and the starling has this little stubby tail, which is pretty short, and they look very small and compact when they're flying. So woodpeckers come to a lot of bird feeders in the Toronto area. Downy woodpecker and hairy woodpecker look very, very similar. The plumage is almost the exact same. There are a few things that we can look at to tell them apart. One thing is size. It's really hard to judge size when you don't have anything to compare it to. So if you know the size of the bird feeder that it's on, that can be helpful. Or best case scenario, if you see the two of them together, that's a huge clue. One thing you can look at is the size of the bill, which matches up well with the size of the body. On a downy woodpecker, this bill is tiny and stubby, and in a hairy woodpecker, it's very, very big and noticeably big. When you look at the tail feathers, downy woodpecker has some black speckling. Hairy woodpecker, they're pretty much pure white, but you don't often see that. Looking at the heads closer, he's got the short bill, not nearly as wide as the rest of the length of the head. And a hairy bill length is about as wide as the rest of the head. You can kind of compare a bird with mourning doves and rock pigeons. Both doves, fairly similar. We can look at the wings on a mourning dove, just have some blotches, whereas rock doves or rock pigeons have these two black bands or wing bars. When you look at the tail on a mourning dove, it's very pointy. And this is really obvious when they sit on power lines or fences. And a pigeon's just going to be squared right off. When they're flying, mourning dove has got a brown back. Pigeon's got this white area called a rump just above the tail on the back. Pigeons can be confusing because pigeons are selectively bred. They're kept in captivity a lot, used for racing and things. And a lot of these genetics escape into the wild. And some super weird ones they breed for, I don't know why, but they make this really, an inflated pigeon. And then they've got this curly pigeon. They have a pigeon with the fully feathered feet, and then this weird looking pigeon seems like it's wearing a fur coat. So you could really encounter anything out there. Pay attention to those pigeon flocks in Toronto. And the last comparison are the common gulls that you often see standing around parking lots. No such thing as a seagull. There's a ton of different gulls that we have here in Ontario. Two of the common ones are ring-billed and herring gulls. Ring-billed gull, much smaller than a herring gull. Really obvious when they're standing together in a parking lot. The bill has a ring around it, as you might expect. Herring gull just has a red spot. Ring-billed gull, yellow legs. Herring gull, pink legs. When we get a little closer in, ring-billed gull has a red eye ring. Again, the angle on the bill, it's kind of like a dainty, smallish bill. And then the herring gull has this big hulking bill, and you can see it's got a really sharp angle on the bottom. And the eye ring is much more pale, it's kind of orangey. Best way to identify birds is by their vocalizations. And this is something that we need to rely on heavily for many of the survey methods, including the work that I do. If you imagine going out into the woods in late May, early June, it's all leafed out. It's pretty much impossible to see anything. So it's great when you can't see birds. And then there are some species that are so similar, we have to rely on their vocalizations to tell them apart. And each one of these species on this slide, different species, there's a group of flycatchers that are very similar to the point where some of them we can't even tell apart when we catch them and we have them in the hand and we can take measurements. You need to hear them. If you're interested in about birdsong, because it is kind of, a big thing to get past, there's a free app, the Merlin Bird ID app, and it's completely free. And it's really, really handy when you're starting out, because if you can record any clear bird sound using this app, it will tell you what it is. And it also has a photo ID section where you can upload any bird photo to the app. And again, as long as the photo is reasonable, it should be able to tell you what it is. It's a lot of people who aren't even necessarily into birds will get this app, and then they'll just, when they're out walking and there's birds singing, they'll just have it running and they can see exactly what's around them. And it does make mistakes, but it is quite good in this area. Another free thing that you can play with if you're interested in birdsong is a program called Raven Light. It's also created by Cornell. And you can download this for free online. And then you can upload any bird sound that you've recorded into it, and it'll break it down visually so that you can actually look at the different parameters. This top section is shows you how loud the bird song is, and this bottom section what frequency it's at. Once you've looked at a few of these, you can start to tell what this is going to sound like, and it can be really helpful for, again, identifying some bird recordings. It's just looking at this. That's about it. When you use all these bird ID things together, you should be able to figure out almost every bird. And there's, I think, around 300 species are seen right in the GTA every year. If you use eBird, you can also, on top of keeping track of your own birds, you can look up areas to go around the city. You might even be able to find an area that's very close to you where you can see a lot of stuff. You can look up species lists. eBird is a great tool. That is a real good snapshot of a whole bunch of different subjects and a lot of information.
Thanks, Brendan. That was great. We have a few minutes. You got through a lot of really good information. Just want to put it out to the group. If there are any questions or any areas that they'd like to see some expansion on, you can try raising your hand. I can try unmuting you, or you can pop it into the chat. And I can read it out. We'll just give it a minute. Like I said, there was a lot to take in. Oh, it's good though.
It was a ton of information. And if anybody thinks of any questions or has anything later, feel free to shoot me an email as well.
Right. I see your emails on the screen right now, so people can take note of that. Well, they think, and so I don't forget, I'm just popping the survey into the chat for anyone that needs to leave before the end of the time. So we do have a question from Callie, Robinson Callie, about how many calories. Not sure what that's in relation to, though. Can you do you recall, Brendan, or do you want me to get some expansion on that?
I'm not sure.
Okay. We'll just see if we can get some clarification on that one. Kaylee, how many calories in regards to what? I'm wondering if it's about how many calories like a baby bird needs, maybe, because you were talking about oh, how many bird species?
How many bird species in the world, or in, if we're talking about the GTA?
Start with GTA. I mean, like, oh, Ontario. Can you go
Ontario? So Ontario, I think the record for bird species that have been, it's up over 400 now that have been recorded here, but that includes a lot of species that you'd call vagrants. So we end up with birds that get lost sometimes and show up here. In an average year, there's probably closer to 350, 360 species that you'll find.
Okay, that's great. So a lot. Ruth has a question about has there been discussions on adjusting bird observation dates to allow netting for earlier in the season to see if migration dates are changing?
That's a good question. One thing with the migration monitoring stations is you need to really keep it standardized over the years. But luckily, they start the program so early in the year that most of the species, even if they are shifting their migrations a little bit earlier, we would still be able to catch them. But the main issue is that these long distance migrants that they're targeting probably aren't able to shift earlier, just because where they're wintering, they don't know what the spring temperatures are like here. So we actually start opening the nets sometime in mid to early April, and then they'll remain open until the very beginning of June, which is when birds really start breeding. And ideally, we don't want to be catching birds as they're trying to breed, because we're kind of inconveniencing them as they're feeding young and stuff.
Yeah, you don't want to stress them too much. And I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned too, there's other techniques. So like some of the ones that use like the chips, I guess that wouldn't matter about adjusting dates, because the birds have the MODIS tracking system on them. So you'll catch them when they fly by, regardless of netting. Right. Okay. So
yeah, for my research, that's for sure. Oh, you have another comment. Geese flew over today. Yeah, it's the geese are really moving in early this year. You better watch your back. I know when I was doing my PhD where I was on campus, I could look out my office window and there was always a goose that would set up just right out in the walking area, and you could just watch the people coming up to it, and you know exactly how it was going to go every time. It's really entertaining.
all right, we do have another question too. Do the changes in winter patterns affect birds? For example, it's really cold and snowy and then all the snow melts. So I guess those wide fluctuations, how do those impact birds?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's probably not good. There's a lot of, specifically one thing that we often have down here is we have owls that will come down from Northern Ontario in the winter here, and they rely on feeding on voles and things. And when there's no snow, that's pretty good. It's easy to catch voles. But when you get a bit of snow earlier in the year, and then you get a few freeze thaw events, sometimes you get like a thick crust of ice on top of the snow, and it can make it a lot harder for them to feed, and they need to spend a lot more time searching around than they normally would. This year, it seems like this total lack of snow and warm temperatures has been, I know the robins around my house are really enjoying it. They're already eating worms and out and about, but for many of the species that are actually here in the winter, these extreme changes are not a good thing.
So it does depend, like the impact would depend on the species and kind of the ecological niche that they inhabit.
Yeah, the birds that live here in the winter time, it's not a great thing for them. One problem they're finding up in Algonquin, they have a long-term study on a species of bird called a Canada jay, actually. And Canada jays like to cache food supplies, and then they eat them throughout the winter. It's one of the things they use, and they'll get chunks of animal fat and other things. And they found that nowadays, sometimes the temperatures get so warm that these caches of food are going rancid before the birds get to eat them. So that's another way that it's not great.
Another unexpected. I'd say we have about 2 more minutes until we wrap. So there is time for probably one more question if there is one in the group. There was a comment in the Q&A, but I'm not quite sure what it's going for, and it's listed as anonymous. So it says original bird nesting place is real home, not wintering location. If there is any expansion on that, you can pop it into the chat or the Q&A, but I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, I think they're saying that maybe they're looking for clarification on where the bird's real home is. And these birds would have originally been in the tropics, and migration is something that has evolved over time. So these migrations would have started much, much shorter. where they're just moving slightly out of the tropics. And then kind of, over a very, very long period of time, they're migrating more and more and more as a way to escape this intense competition. In the tropics, the birds live, sometimes 15, 20 years, and they hold down the same territories. There's just it's really hard to make a living down there. And they nest very infrequently and low numbers of eggs.
Fair enough. And it is interesting then, like if the migration pattern of having two different habitat types is that established, they would need both to thrive and reproduce, to arguably, right? So it's not that they have one true home, they have two different ecological needs.
Absolutely. It's the misconceptions people think it's our birds when it's kind of their birds.
I mean, that's also probably one of the reasons why we have such different legislation around like migratory birds too. It's not one government that oversees.
Yeah.
All right, well, go ahead, Brendan.
No, I was just going to say that in itself it's a whole other thing, because with protecting migrant birds, they go through so many different countries. You need to get so many people on the same page to actually adequately protect them. It can be troublesome.
Yes. Although then you do have some of those really wild success stories like Canadian geese, which are internationally managed and doing very well now.
Yeah, they're really hated in some places. I think in New Zealand, they're having problems with them.
Well, like you said, I get attacked constantly, so I have my own personal issues with them, but it's more of a fear-based issue. All right, well, we've hit 11, so I want to be mindful of the time, and everyone has other meetings and events to go to. So thank you, Brendan, for a lovely presentation. It was a lot of useful information, and we will be sharing the recording with the whole group so they can use it to prepare for their Envirothon events. So again, if you could take a chance to do the survey, it would be helpful for us. And yeah, thank you again, Brendan. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. I hope you guys learned something about birds today.